There are moments in your life that never quite leave you. Decisions you made in a heartbeat that echo for decades. My name is Margaret. I'm 85 years old, and I still think about the marriage proposal I turned down in 1964. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September. I remember because the leaves were just starting to turn, and I was wearing my blue cardigan, the one with the pearl buttons my mother had given me for my birthday. Robert asked me to meet him at the park bench where we'd had our first conversation 2 years earlier. I knew what was coming. I'd known for weeks. He was a jazz pianist, not famous, but deeply talented in a way that made you forget where you were when he played. He had these hands that moved across the keys like they were having a conversation with something invisible. We met at a dinner party hosted by my college roommate. I was studying to be a teacher. He was playing background music that nobody was supposed to pay attention to, but I couldn't stop watching him. We fell in love the way young people do when they don't yet understand what love will cost them. Everything felt urgent and infinite at the same time. He would play for me in empty practice rooms. I would bring him coffee and sit in the back while he rehearsed with his trio. My parents liked him well enough, but I could see the concern in my mother's eyes. Jazz musicians didn't have steady incomes. They traveled. They lived unpredictable lives. When Robert proposed that September afternoon, he was honest with me in a way I'll never forget. He said he wanted to marry me more than anything, but he also told me what that would mean. He'd been offered a chance to join a touring band. Real money, real exposure, but it meant 6 months on the road, maybe more. He said we could make it work. He said love was enough. I looked at him sitting there with his grandmother's ring in a small velvet box, and I felt two futures pulling me in opposite directions. One future was full of music and adventure and uncertainty. Late nights waiting for phone calls from different cities, struggling to pay rent, wondering if his dreams would ever turn into stability. The other future was the one I'd been raised to want. A respectable husband with a predictable job, a house in a good neighborhood, children, security. I told him I needed time to think. He said, of course, take all the time you need. But we both knew that wasn't really true. The band was leaving in 3 weeks. I went home and I did what I thought was the rational thing. I made a list. I talked to my mother. I talked to my older sister, who had just gotten married to an accountant. Everyone told me the same thing. Love is important, but it's not everything. You need stability. You need someone who can provide. 2 weeks later, I met him at the same bench and I said no. I told him I cared about him deeply, but I couldn't build a life on uncertainty. I needed something more solid. He didn't argue with me. He didn't try to change my mind. He just nodded slowly, put the ring back in his pocket, and said he understood. Then he told me he hoped I'd find everything I was looking for. 6 months after that, I started dating Thomas. He was an engineer, kind, reliable, exactly the sort of man my parents hoped I'd marry. We got engaged after a year. We had a small wedding. We bought a house. We had 2 children. Thomas was a good husband and a good father. He provided for us. He never forgot a birthday or an anniversary. He coached our son's Little League team. He helped our daughter with her science projects. But there were nights, many nights over the years, when I'd lie awake and wonder about the life I didn't choose. I'd wonder where Robert was, if he was still playing music, if he ever thought about me. I'd imagine myself in dimly lit jazz clubs in cities I'd never visited, watching him play, being part of that world I'd been too afraid to enter. I told myself I'd made the right choice. I had stability. I had children who needed me. I had a life that made sense on paper. But there was always this quiet ache underneath everything. This feeling that I'd chosen safety over something true. Thomas died 4 years ago. It was sudden, a heart attack. One morning he was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, and by that afternoon he was gone. The grief was real and deep, but it was also complicated in ways I didn't expect. I mourned him. I mourned our life together. But I also felt something else, a strange kind of liberation mixed with regret. About a year after Thomas passed, my daughter was helping me clean out the attic. We found an old box of records I'd forgotten about, jazz albums from the early 60s. She put one on the record player we'd kept for nostalgia, and suddenly there was music filling the house again. Real music, the kind that makes you feel something you can't quite name. I started going to jazz clubs, just to listen. There's a small place downtown that has live music on Thursday nights. I'd sit in the back with a glass of wine and let the music wash over me. And I'd think about Robert. I'd think about the person I might have been if I'd said yes. I never tried to find him. Part of me was afraid of what I'd discover, that he'd moved on completely and never looked back. Or worse, that he'd struggled and never made it, and I'd have to carry the weight of knowing I could have been there with him. So I just wondered. I wondered for decades. Then last spring, my granddaughter showed me something on her phone. She'd been researching jazz history for a school project, and she stumbled across a documentary about musicians from the 1960s. There was a section about a touring band that had become moderately successful. And there he was, Robert. Older, grey-haired, but unmistakably him. Still playing, still alive with that same energy I remembered. The documentary mentioned that he'd never married. He'd spent his whole life on the road, playing music in small clubs and occasional festivals. He looked happy, tired, but happy. There was a moment in the interview where they asked him if he had any regrets, and he paused for a long time before answering. He said he wished he'd been braver about asking for what he wanted. He didn't elaborate, but something in the way he said it made my chest tighten. I don't know if he was talking about me. Maybe he was. Maybe he wasn't. But sitting there watching him play in that grainy footage, I realized something I'd been avoiding my whole life. I didn't turn down Robert's proposal because I was being rational or practical. I turned it down because I was afraid of uncertainty, afraid of disappointing people, afraid of wanting something that didn't fit the script I'd been given for how my life should go. Thomas gave me a good life. My children are wonderful. I have grandchildren I adore. I don't regret my family, but I do regret the fear. I regret choosing what other people thought I should want, instead of listening to what I actually wanted. I regret not trusting myself enough to take the risk. The question that haunts me isn't whether I made the wrong choice, it's whether I made a choice at all, or if I just let fear decide for me. I'm 85 years old now. I've lived a full life by most measures, but there are still nights when I lie awake and wonder about the version of myself I never became. The woman who said yes to uncertainty. The woman who chose passion over security. The woman who trusted that love might actually be enough. I think about Robert's hands on those piano keys. I think about the music we could have made together, not literally, but in the way two people create a life that's entirely their own. I think about what it would have felt like to choose something because it made me come alive, not because it made sense to everyone else. Maybe that path would have been harder. Maybe we would have struggled. Maybe we would have failed. But at least it would have been ours. At least I would have known what it felt like to be that brave. If you're young and you're facing a choice between what you want and what you think you should want, I hope you'll be braver than I was. I hope you'll trust yourself enough to take the risk. Because the safe choice isn't always the right choice. Sometimes the thing that scares you most is exactly the thing you need to do. I still think about that Tuesday in September. I still see Robert sitting on that bench with his grandmother's ring. And I still wonder who I would have become if I'd said yes.